So, one of the main critiques of this kind of event is that we all agree, and we're all friends, and it's all very cozy. And to an extent that is very true, because we're all united in the idea that we want to create a more beautiful world. But I am pretty sure that our opinions don't always align, and that we don't have all the answers. So as an effort to try and push this movement forwards this year, we have invited an external voice to discuss what we are promoting and how it can be refined. Arild Eriksen is a Norwegian architect and public figure, unafraid of discussing the issues of our time. He's done great political work in the realm of social housing. He's collected through us a panel of relevant people. You know John Simpson and Robert Adam from yesterday and today's talk on new urbanism projects. They representing the English movement of trying to change how we build our world. We also have Ola Fjeldheim, the General Secretary of the National Trust, with an overview of the historic, how things have been done in this country before. We also have Eric Zapel. Architecture students will know him from the floor plan housing manual. It's co-authored, American architect and Berlin-based designer. I'll give the word to you, Arild. Please help us understand our issues clearly.
Now you made it sound like I'm the guy who's going to sort of make people scream and run for the mixer to turn me off, you know. But that's probably not going to happen. And I also wanted to sort of tell a bit about why I wanted this particular group in the panel discussion, and also like 5 minutes after I posted this event on my Instagram account, there was like at least 2 women who said, "Couldn't you find a girl in your panel?" And I agree, you know, and we also tried as well. So there's no reason. I'm sure there's a lot of women who could take part in this, but I think I found a nice conversation group as well. And like I wrote when you asked me what I was going to talk about, I said like there is a popular uprising in Norway and in many other countries as well, and people express their gut feelings while professionals sort of respond with this kind of technical jargon and spreadsheets and so on. And I've been working with participation in urban planning for many years, and there's never has been any material impact of that. It means like even if the only thing a community wants is like 3 stories instead of 5, it never happens. So that has to do with public investment and many other things, but it's also this idea that sort of people shouldn't really sort of interfere with, not necessarily architecture, but with public property development, which is a big problem in Norway, and it's probably everywhere else as well. So the question here is like, how can we create a resident-made city with architecture that people actually like, and how is this like done in other countries? And maybe we should also ask ourselves, what if participation doesn't lead to the beautiful architecture people are hoping for, which is also, I think, in my experience as an architect who wants to make beautiful buildings, and it's also very often architecture that people here would like, but you have a client who wants a box or who wants to cut away all the quality of the building, and maybe you also have a planning authorities who wants the same. And when is that? So we have invited Robert Adam, and I think the reason why I ask you is that now you quit Adam Architecture in 2020. No, sorry. In 2020.
That's John Simpson.
Yeah. But it's the first time I meet you. But we used Field Farm in the book, which is called The New Neighbourhood, which I wrote with Sarah Sorori.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And the reason why that is a kind of contemporary vernacular in a way that in me is not necessarily a vernacular, but it's like contemporary classicist architecture that has all the qualities of a low dense architecture that most young architects today wants to build. And also for you, like I visited Fairford Lace with Oslo School of Architecture in 2016 already. It's quite long ago, and it's also a bit the same. And I think the reason why I mentioned these two sort of projects is that it's obviously based on a design code of some sort, and maybe not, but you can elaborate on that later on as well. But it also has a kind of an openness to development, to step-by-step development that is really, really inspiring to everyone who works with urban planning. Eric, I invited you also because I think it's because we met you when we were working with the new neighborhood. But you're also an academic who worked with plan drawings in book form, and I think also it's really interesting because the argument against traditional classical architecture is that plan drawings are so complicated and buildings are so complicated, so you have to sort of let that building express that complicated drawings, and we're going to draw more. And you have also a lot of knowledge about design code based architecture in Norway. So I want to open with a question that every one of you could answer. Which is now when several Norwegian cities are trying to make a design code. Oslo is making one. We have helped Tønsberg in the early phases of making one. Bergen is talking about one as well, and Bergen really needs one. This is my hometown. It's like it's in a kind of a crisis, and a common feature of these is like. It's mainly not a kind of a participatory process. It's experts meeting the local council. But what would a good participatory process look like? And we can start with you.
Okay, so I'll go first. But just a brief preface, if I may. Up until the British government changed, which it did 6 months ago, I was on a government committee called the Office of Place, with one of the objectives was to introduce codes into the government system. And a very important part of producing those codes was forms of public consultation. And as John, I'm sure, is saying, we've both been involved in public consultation, and they're frequently manipulated. They don't have to be manipulated, they clearly are. One of the leaders, a chap called John Thompson in Britain who did this, told developers he could get anything he wanted with public participation, because often it was so vague. But I would say the interesting thing that we came up with in the Office of Place in participation was using digital processes. In other words, the trouble with public participation is getting people to participate. That's a real problem, much again to turn up. And secondly is to stop them being bullied by professionals throwing their weight around. And a certain amount of caution, and the fact also that you've got to be very careful you don't end up using professional language here. But what was developed, it was a very interesting development, was the use of the internet for people to actually get apps, and we found the response was very high from those, because people could just do it. The problem is actually then processing them. In one authority, was the British government did certain experiments, and I always quote this one, I mustn't speak for too long, but I'll quote this one, where actually this particular city council, it was Hemel Hempstead, did a very, very good piece of public consultation. It's extremely good. It came up with very clear results. The local officials got hold of it, and they said, well, yes, that's interesting, but what do they really mean? And they decided they really meant something which they didn't actually mean. And they said, but they then claimed they'd have public participation. So that was, I mean, I think it's and John, I'm sure you've been through a similar process, but maybe different from mine as well. But the other one is code writing. And I was one of the people that drafted the sort of 10 definitions of a code for which the government used. But the key one, first of all, the key one is there's only 2 answers to a code as a contrary to a guide, and one is yes and the other is no. You can use percentages and things like that. But what we discovered was that local officials did not want us to do this, because with the minute you actually fixed something, it took away their discretionary power. So, for example, we went out, the government paid these local authorities to come up with examples, and we said these must have imperatives in them. So instead of saying, buildings must be between, X and Y height or something of that nature, they said you must consider this, which is not a code. So what it did, it left this open gate for them to mess around with it. But I mean, John, you've written codes, I've written codes. It's moderately straightforward, but the other thing is, too much code is a design. A code has to have a latitude in it, otherwise you've just designed it. So, I mean, I'll let John speak about it now.
Yeah. No, Bob's absolutely right. It's not a code if it doesn't actually get a yes or no answer from it, because how else do you implement it? And the big problem with codes is the implementation, because it takes as much time to assess a scheme and make sure that it conforms to the code as well. It can take a lot of time, put it that way. So the only simple way of doing it is to have a yes and no answer, because by doing that, you just take out both the discretion, but also take out that problem with where you have an unknown that a developer, because a developer and a landowner wants to have certainty. They want to be in a position where they know what they're doing, they know which architect to choose, so they can then just get on with the project and make sure that they maximize the chances of actually getting it through planning. And of course they've tried, and one idea is really to actually fast-track things. If you have a code and you have certain criteria which are set for a project, you can fast-track it if all the answers are yes, and you're within the whole thing, then you can cut out a whole series of processes and just go straight to the next stage. And of course, that's probably a way of doing it, which will actually make it so much easier and so much quicker and so much more attractive, because it's got to be attractive to the landowner or the person applying and paying for the job, because that's the way of selling it and making sure that everybody's on board working on the whole thing. But that's one way of making it work. But of course you've got to get the code together in the first place, which, I mean, if it's only a yes or no answer, you've got to make sure that that code is a code which is not only workable, but actually going to be satisfy the objectives that you're setting out to do. Because in other words, if it satisfies the code and you end up with a terrible design that everybody hates, you're going to be in a very difficult position.
The thing it does is that most land, I mean, certainly in Britain, most land is sold on the open market. People bid for it. Now, if the person that takes the biggest risk, generally speaking, offers the highest price, and if the regulations are vague, they will gamble on manipulating those regulations. The second thing is, as a follow from what John said, is that risk costs money. And so the less risk there is when you're making a bid, the more accurate the bids are going to be. And in principle, you'll effectively you'll take the risk cost out of it, and you'll have more money for the development.
Talking about risk, in Germany, the planning regime is that you are sort of making all the agreements and you are deciding everything that is sort of costs money before you do the zoning plan. Especially here it's going to be 20% social housing, here it's going to be, that's really interesting in Germany. And I think, is it does the zoning plan process also include participation in terms of architectural styles and design codes?
So I have actually relatively little experience with codes, unfortunately, but what I do know just from my time in Berlin and my time working at Sebastian Treese, when things are being debated in Germany, there is a very lively debate. There are petitions, there are public signatures to try to prevent certain things, and that is definitely not just something that is a suggestion. At a certain point, it actually can stop these certain processes. So yes, there is a level of participation from the public that is legally binding as well.
Yes, and that is something which is really nice about it as well, because it has to do with the cost and what kind of limitations you put on the zoning plan and the plots before you start to do to start to sell it. But I know that you have a lot of knowledge about different Norwegian cities and towns that have made design codes, which is quite strict. And do you also have some thoughts about what has been a good process for them and why has it been that?
Yeah, first I say I totally agree with you gentlemen. It's very correct and very precise. My organization, we have local branches all over the country, and then we work up against the local authorities. And my organization has been doing that for a lot of time. And in my office, I have a couple of guys helping them as much as they can. And the main problem in Norway is that there's a lot of power placed in the hands of local politicians, and that's a good thing because that's democracy. But it's a bad thing because they are quite easy to persuade from doing other things than the code says. And the people that are the best at persuading is the people that has the most money. That's the way it works. I think the main problem is that politicians don't follow the code as soon as it's made. And I think it's maybe the most important thing then is to make a code that they do respect and they have a deep respect for it, and the only way to do that is through a very thorough democratic process. And we have a lot of experience with heritage restriction plans in Norway, and also, of course there are also development plans. And the first ones, they came in the 60s in Stavanger, that's the first one. And there's a Norwegian organization, NICU, it's Norwegian National Institute for Cultural Studies. And they have studied these processes, and they say that the plans and the codes that are really lasting a long time is the one that's been a lot of democratic process. It's taken a lot of time to make them, involved a lot of people, and that's the only way to make codes that last many years. We have Skudeneshavn, a small wooden town in the western parts of Norway. Risør, small wooden town in the southern parts of Norway. And they have made plans then basically from the 70s, and they're still pretty much the same things. And I think there's a recipe in there that's it's important to follow. So I think it's engaging people, that's important. And to do that, you have to work a lot on the ground and keep the experts away for as long as possible, as you said.
Can I say a point about public participation in this, is that, I don't know if you've had this experience, John, sometimes there's a great thing about getting people to actually turn up and do it, and obviously not be manipulated and participate properly. And we made this point in the work that we were doing, if you ask people certain questions in a way, and then the documents come out, and people can't see what they said in the document, they won't trust you. I won't believe you, and in future they won't bother to try, because they say, well, this is just a confidence trick. There's a very typical kind of public participation. Let me say it's like this. This is a true case, actually. This is a public participation from the local community saying, do you want your local community to be a thriving, successful place? Yes or no? Well, you're not going to say no, are you? And if you say no, they'll ignore it anyway. So it's the issue of how you manage the public, so it's realistic and they can genuinely see end results. And people aren't stupid. If they actually see the codes coming out that don't reflect what they said, they simply won't trust you anymore and they won't bother to participate.
Then maybe you can follow up on that, because I'm thinking, how do you, like in meeting clients and landowners, make it possible for people's participation to get like visible results?
Well, it's all to do with, I mean, the best participation is usually when you've got a scheme and people look at that and they can see what it is that you're presenting. But by then, you know, the code is something that would have to precede that. It would be something that then would need to be put together in a way. I mean, the thing is that things like, do you want a prosperous town, is not part of a code. I mean, that is nothing to do with what we're talking about. You're just assuming that you want a prosperous town. Why would you want anything else? There got to be the right issues that are discussed and the right issues which are pinpointed, and that's to some extent what the code has got to do in the first place. So it needs to establish what those things are that are to be decided, and things will not be the same in every part of a city, so you can't actually have a general code which is going to be universal. There'll be some things which are universal, but things which are not universal, they'll only apply to certain places, because you still want to get the diversity within a city. You don't want it all to be the same. So you've got to get the diversity between different cities, and you've got to get diversities within the cities and within the different areas, so that the heritage and the history and everything within that particular area is reflected in the new buildings, and the structure as well. You get different urban morphologies, which are specific to a particular place. I mean, in Birmingham, for instance, you've got the Jewellery Quarter, which has a very different morphology to other parts of Birmingham because of the history of the place, because it involved creating workshops and things like that, and that set a certain kind of morphology. So these are the things that you're putting into the code. You're putting things which, on the one hand, relate to the relationship of different buildings to one another, heights of buildings and all that kind of thing come in. And that's not a new code. I mean, codes like that exist in New York, exist in Berlin, exist all over the place. And perhaps one might say tend to be too rigid on the wrong things, but that's another thing to talk about. And then, of course, there's the whole thing to do with what the buildings are like and what the architecture is like, and how that needs to be taken into account. And you still want to have a position where you have some. You don't want everything the same as well. You still want to have a process where you get a good architect designing something and is putting something forward which might break some of those codes, but is actually doing something very good. And you want to have a process where that kind of thing can also come in as part of it. But then they're different things. They're different things. Different clients will want to do different things. Some clients will just want certainty. They'll just want to do something ordinary, and what the code wants to do from them is just make sure that they don't do anything which is wrong and outlandish. Whereas you might get another client who wants to do something special. And from that point of view, you want to encourage them. You want to encourage them to actually come up with something which is good, but within the whole idea of what is acceptable within that area in terms of its architecture.
Interesting, John. I think perhaps you and I ought to compare notes a bit more, because I'm interested in your zoning aspect of it and some of the stuff you've illustrated. Of technique which is different from that, which I've used, which is what I call traffic lights, is that some areas are just more coded than others. In other words, you just introduce more code. There are critical areas, which is maybe you do that as well, but I think what you would look at something slightly different, which is interesting. And the other one is saying, well, 10% of these properties don't have to have anything to do with the code except for height and materials. Interesting enough, I've never seen a developer take that up, but I have included them. But the other thing about selling to landowners is most places are developed over a period of time and by several developers. If a developer knows that the same quality codes are going to go to the adjacent site, and therefore the quality, the value of their properties are not going to be let down by somebody doing something not so good next door, they're much more comfortable with it, because the danger is that if you start off controlling something a lot, or you've got a good architect, and then you go to the next one and it's no good, they're mostly being built at the same time, and it affects the value, and you end up going down a downhill route. And what one can persuade landowners saying that if you introduce codes, because that will actually affect the long-term land value. If something starts to go downhill, the land value starts to go downhill. So you can say to a landowner, if you control this, the most important thing is to control it throughout, and that way your land value will be protected and should rise, because people will begin to perceive the quality, and therefore when they perceive the quality, the value of the property should rise.
Let's talk a bit about diversity, because I think now I think most urban planners wants to make 10-minute neighborhoods. And I think, obviously, from the projects I've seen from you, it's also it's like that kind of ambitions. Either if it's from the beginning with that is happening, and I think I also argued a bit, like when people talk about traditional architecture, I say that traditional architecture is, of course, is a practice and is a tradition, but it's also functions. It also means that. If you have a place like Fredrikstad, the old city in Fredrikstad, which probably not every one of you have seen, it's like a fortified city. And it has traditional buildings, but it has sheds. And it has places where you brew beer. And all of them looks very different. And it doesn't, and some of there are still like ironmongers and these kind of things. And that makes out for a really diversity. But how do you create that kind of diversity in the design code plan for a contemporary neighborhood, which is usually only economy for making houses, because if you're going to have a blacksmith, of course, it's going to be, you have to have a cheaper plot of land or cheaper rents. And do you have any experience in sort of enforcing that kind of diversity of a 10-minute city within the framework?
John had some very good illustrations of diversity not being done very well. I've tried means of doing this, and you've maybe got a better one than I have, where you don't just have what some developers do is A, B, C, A, B, C, A, B, C, and then call that diversity. I personally think it's quite a complex issue, because a lot of housing developers have just types that they want to roll out. And of course, sequential development, natural development, produces diversity without really trying. But I actually don't have an easy answer. You may have a better answer than me, John.
Well, the thing is that we're talking at the moment about just restricting people. And the reality is there are other ways of actually also doing it by encouragement rather than just by restricting. And one of the things that comes out of, or has come out of all these developments is that they are actually more valuable. They're more valuable, the houses get more money, not just in the first instance, but they hold their value for a longer time. And they are become, as the place gets a reputation as being a good place to live in, people are fighting to buy the houses, so the prices just go up. So if a developer has a longer term interest in the whole thing, he can actually capitalize on that. Whereas if a developer doesn't, they can't, because they've sold the houses, and the people who actually capitalize on this are the people who've bought the houses. So you have to actually, if you organize things, but that's only because we've organized things that way, in the way we develop. A developer goes, buys the site, and he just builds the houses, and he sells them, and he's gone. But if landowners and developers and people who are involved in housing actually keep a longer term interest in it. I mean, one way is actually, a lot of companies have trouble getting staff and getting people, workers, etc., who are skilled to come and to certain places to actually come and work with them. And the thing is that if they invested as part of this in the development, either by retaining some sort of value of a part, ownership of the property or whatever, so you actually make it more affordable for younger people to come and move in, and then they can use it as on the stepping on the ladder as they then move on, they sell it, and then they can afford a bigger house and a better house, and they can just move on. But by doing that, you involve landowners, or you involve local businesses, people like that, who can then have part ownership in these things, so you can actually make it easier for people to own the land and own a house and move in, and at the same time those companies or those landowners actually are able to get something out of it, either a rent or skills or something like that. And by doing that, you build in diversity as well, because the diversity comes with that. The reason the jewelry quarter was a jewelry quarter in Birmingham is because that's an area where people made jewelry. And the same, you know, if you think of the Huguenots who came to Britain and they had their weaving workshops, etc., and their buildings are different.
I have remembered a technique for diversity, so I forgot it. But one thing is use of percentages, very useful. In other words, you can say, well, you'll have X percent of this and Y percent of it. You don't say exactly where it's going to be, and you can restrict it. The other one, of course, is identifying uses, a variety of uses. And the other one is, I'm sure you do the same, John, I think you illustrated, in fact, is what I call key buildings. You can actually say these key buildings have either more restrictive codes or certain heights. There are techniques for actually deliberately introducing diversity.
I want to change a bit.
Eric, just the diversity. I think it is helpful also to look at just historical, I mean, it sounds simple, but historical examples where this diversity does exist within neighborhoods. My hometown of Chicago is a very modern city plan. There are blocks where it is very strictly laid out. These are shopping corridors. There's one cross section. In the middle, there's a school or a church. On the second cross section, there are bars or small shops, lanes, tertiary streets, and that grid repeats itself throughout the city. Very low-slung buildings, 2-3 stories maximum. The downtown is something completely different, hovers over all of these housing. This is where you work. You have your industrial areas as well, smokestacks, at least in the past. They're still there, but they don't smoke anymore. And where I've lived now for the past 20 years in Berlin, it's a completely different story. I've never been to a city that doesn't have a center in that sense like Berlin does. The basic structure of the town is a 22-meter high building. Front is, of course, the representative building, and the courtyards in many areas go back 2, 3, 4 times, even to the other streets. And these areas in the past were workshops. They were working spaces, they were factories. They have become offices. Some of them are still workshops as well. And you get out at any random station in the city, well, at least within the ring itself, and there are people going to work through the same door that children are going to school, through the same door that people are leaving to walk down to the corner store, and doctors' offices are on the ground floor. And that is, in one sense for me, very confusing, but it works incredibly well to keep these neighborhoods lively. I think that might be something that you were getting at.
I think this is really interesting, because now there is this kind of movement in Norway to make more like city blocks, you know, with inner courtyards. And because I was taking part in this Make City Festival in Berlin, there was a woman called Christian Ring who was talking about the Berlin mix,
exactly,
which is that mix you're talking about. And I think now in Norway, it's really hard to sort of to get that kind of mix, but I think we are sort of trying to promote it, and I think that's one of the really interesting ways to make that kind of urban typology work in a way. But I think someone needs to give me some like 5 minutes left when there's 5 minutes left or something. You are going to do it, yeah? Because I obviously we could just sit here talking about this for a long time. And when in terms of this diversity, and I think like you probably both made design codes that also allow for topography and so on. But I think I want to talk a bit more about. I used the word vernacular earlier. That's not the correct word. I'm looking for a word which is called like contemporary traditional architecture. And I also, because we have been discussing a lot about that, because you have sort of, in a kind of interesting way, taken the national, what you call it in English? Conservation? National Trust?
National Trust of Norway.
National Trust. Of course it's about our building heritage, but it's also about sustainability. And I think you can talk a bit more about that, because I think that's a very interesting thing to include in the design codes, especially the ones that Oslo, Bergen, Fredrikstad are now using, are developing, sorry.
Maybe of course, I like to say that I like to look at the traditional buildings in Norway. That's buildings from prior to the 1940s, because in the 1940s we developed rules for how to make a house that, in some ways, removed the carpenter out of the equation, so to say, and we started doing things in another way. And a famous Norwegian man studying this for many years, Jon Godal, he says that when the regulations came, you moved everything over to the bureaucrats and not the builders anymore, and that's kind of interesting. And if you look at, I used to say that all the old buildings in Norway made before the 1950s, they're sustainable. They are circular economy, everything, all the checks you can do. But of course it's some problems, because in some areas it's difficult to house enough people. That was one of the reasons that changed the building industry in Norway. But I think it's a lot to learn by studying how these houses were built, what kind of technology were used, and what kind of materials, and what kind of crafts and craftsmen. But of course, if you want to build a house in this way today, it's more expensive, and you cannot build in the volume that's normal to expect today. So I think it's a bit way back to the question you were discussing earlier on. It's also about what kind of systems you want, because most developers in Norway today, they are not building houses, they are running an investment business.
Yeah. So
they're not builders, they are investors. And that shapes the houses and shapes the way things work. So if you were breaking up projects into smaller entities, then you can have local builders making more buildings, and you can also have local supply chains, and then you can have more sustainability, more local produce, more local materials, stuff like that. Maybe this is...
That's actually been a very hot issue in Britain at the moment, because of the amount of regulation. The regulation has increased so much that the vast majority of development is done by huge firms. And huge firms systematize. You know, they actually come out with a house and they just put the house anywhere. And I started my career working for housing developers who built 10 houses a year, 20 maybe. The community knew who they were. They lived in the community. They cared a huge amount about the quality of their product. It wasn't always great, but they actually cared about it. But what's happened with the increase of regulation is the risk involved in regulation is the banks won't lend. The risk involved is so great. The statistics are there in Britain. The number of small developers has plummeted, has dipped significantly, and it's largely because of regulation and increased risk. And small developers, I mean, in the States, for example, you get people who just build 1 or 2 houses as almost like a hobby to make money. But in Britain, that's become very, very difficult. It sounds like you've got the same problem.
Yeah, it's becoming almost impossible, isn't it? Yes.
But do you experience that in terms of what I call like contemporary traditional architecture. Last year I went to H.G. Matthews Brick outside of London, and I went to this clay building festival, and it was nice. It was clay and it was extruded earth. It was like different things. But I experienced there that the knowledge of bio-based materials in England is on a completely other level than in Norway. At the same time, of course, we have Frølichbyen, which is built in the late 1800s with really beautiful traditional clay houses, but with lime plaster in colors and so on. But do you think, or do you feel that that kind of bio-based alternative building techniques has a place in today's like contemporary traditional architecture?
Well, no, of course it does, but that's, you know, that's another whole different issue, because it's you're now discussing something which is more to do with construction and availability and economics and all those kind of things, and you can't deal with that at an urban level. I mean, there are certain things which will affect things like solar panels and heating systems and all that kind of thing. But I think you can't get that down to that detail, because it sometimes can backfire. It really can backfire, because you can insist on certain things happening and then they just get twisted.
You went to Field Farm, a very good example of this. We tried to persuade the developer there to use lime render, lime stucco. And they refused. And the reason they refused was very straightforward. They said that because when we finish the plaster, we sell the buildings immediately, but the plaster takes months to dry. So we can't sell a house where you can go along and push your thumb into the plaster, because people won't buy it. And that was just that basic. I mean, we actually had written lime plastering, and they refused to do it. And it was a commercial reason. I mean, in fairness, if I'm a business trying to sell a house, and my business model is I finish the house, and as soon as I finish it, I put it on the market, and people have to come and visit it, and the people come and that's a problem. Well, it's a genuine financial problem, but that's the structure of the market that's doing that.
I have experienced, though, that it is becoming a selling point. That either clients or potential buyers of the housing that we design and build, that it has become increasingly something that people are interested in, they look for, and that increases the value of the selling price in general.
There's also a basic principle, is that when it's a seller's market, the quality goes down. So in other words, if you have a housing surplus, the quality goes up, because buyers can be discerning. It's a fairly well-established principle that the builders that build higher quality houses survive recessions, because in the end you have more discerning buyers and they'll go to the better quality. But if people's financial objective is just to get the product, and they have difficulty getting the product, then of course the people who are doing the development can do almost anything they like, because people are just desperate to get hold of the product. So you need a surplus.
And the surplus is almost impossible to achieve, because who would develop and build houses if they can't sell them?
Yeah.
So it's not an easy problem to solve. It's a problem which completely will always be there.
And how many countries have got a housing problem at the moment? The United States has got a housing problem. Britain's got a housing problem. Spain's got a housing
Germany.
problem. You know.
Yeah, I think almost every country has a housing problem. Some countries has better strategies to counter it than others, and especially like some of the German-speaking countries as well. And I think in a way, the way I know England or Great Britain is that both your offices has a kind of an architectural style that sort of is recognizable to older cities and so on. But and then I'm also, this is where they're going to run and turn off the mixer. It's like when I think about Sebastian Treese's building, I think about a very strict, sleek minimalist, classicist architecture, which in my mind belongs in a kind of, maybe in Germany, maybe in the German-speaking world, in a way. But do you think it's a danger that that kind of architecture becomes a kind of a globalist architecture?
You mean if it becomes...
like everything you can sort of hate with modernism, you know, like is that everywhere in the world, everything looks completely the same. And I love traditional architecture, because traditional architecture is like the stable looks like the stable, and the buildings looks like, and the hospital obviously looks like the hospital.
Yeah. Personally, I'm not necessarily speaking for the office, but personally I do, honestly. At the office, we are not anti-modern. Some of our buildings are very much based on modernist predecessors or references. I think, though, that there needs to be a differentiation, or maybe a specification of what we mean by modernism, because early modernism, you want to call it proto-modernism, is actually some incredible stuff. I am also, Ola, a fan of Castelvecchio, for instance. I know that's much later, but there is a quality, an inspirational quality, and an inspired mind behind these projects. And it was not just a cut, there was kind of a fluid transition to modernism. And that era, whether it's called reform architecture in Germany, or functionalism, or rationalism in Italy, or whatever, there's quite a bit of quality in that as well. And that's something that we at the office also look into. We value these buildings as well. And it's a debate, it's an ongoing debate, But if it becomes, to answer your question, it could potentially be something, if we're doing repetition of the style that our developers maybe want, whether that's traditional or classical. I think long-term there could be a danger that it becomes the new object, the new globalist style of architecture. The difference is going to be the quality, of course. You know, we are a boutique firm.
But
right.
If you're go.
Yes?
We are soon into the closing remarks, so maybe this one is mine already. Of course, I work with preservation and heritage, and that's a reason for that. But as we are talking about securing diversity, I think we already know that we are not going to build that much in the next 50 years. So I think when we're starting a planning operation, what we should do is not to start the planning by discussing what we are about to build, but we should be discussing what we want to keep, and ask people, what do you want to keep in your neighborhood? What do you want to keep in your town? And that's the starting point, and that's quite important, because then you keep the diversity and you keep the quality, and then you can swap out the things that doesn't work. And I think that's an important recipe, and if you start in that end and not in the other, then I think much is done, actually.
We're going to do closing remarks. Is it closing remark? I'm sorry.
I'm just going to, it's like a trick question for everyone here. It's like, when I worked with Saher on the book, we encountered a lot of very inspiring, colorful, fantastic architecture. Especially there was one project it was called Catfiddle Street in South Carolina, in Charleston, which is like the residents bought a plot of land, and they made a design code themselves, and they say, I want to have a Palladian villa, I want to live in a Byzantine building, and said, is it so that everything should be allowed, as long as in a kind of quality-based traditional architectural language? Or do you believe in coherence and more strict architecture?
I think I'll kick off, and you can disagree with me. I design. This
is not a closing remark. This is like pre-closing remark.
Pre-closing. Okay.
Yes.
Well, in that
then
case,
you will have a closing remark.
Okay.
And then we will.
I design quite a lot of houses in the middle of nowhere, really. And quite frankly, if somebody wants to do a modernist house there, they should be able to. In an urban setting, it's really rather different, because actually what you're doing is making a place for other people, not just yourself. I have to tell you a story. I did a development where the planners insisted that there would be 6 modernist buildings in it. And so I designed them. It was a very interesting exercise. I rather enjoyed it. the developer got the drawings and said you've got to be joking and never did them. So even when you try, sometimes it doesn't work. But no. And taking your, I think you made an important point, is that, I mean, one of the first codes I wrote was in Edinburgh, and the instruction I was given is that these codes should apply to the traditional buildings that you design and the kind of buildings that other architects design. And it was still possible to do that, in my opinion, because I could specify something like a cornice. It didn't have to actually be a cornice. I could specify a window-to-wall ratio. There were certain things I could do which would make sure that, although they're architects not out of my stable, so to speak, they could still do something that actually didn't upset the sort of general atmosphere of the place. And I think that's an important thing to remember.
If you have any thoughts on that?
Well, my take on that was I'm a traditionalist. And if I'm designing something in a particular place, I design it according to the traditions of that place. That's the whole point of being a traditionalist. And that way you preserve diversity. You preserve diversity. You can build a Chinese-style building in Paris, but it still has to be done according to the traditions of the place, so that it still appears to be part of Paris.
It's a bit like the Palazzo Ciuppi for Julian Schnabel on Manhattan. The Venetian high-rise, pink.
Well, not quite.
But Eric, you have any comment on this? And then you can have a few short closing words.
Actually, no, I don't have any further comment on this. I think I said what I wanted to say. It's maybe one thing, the tradition, I guess the idea of tradition is something that I think is very interesting, and it's something I think is incredibly important. I guess what you connect to, which tradition that is, that's an open question. And I'm working on a building right now that is very much inspired by Reform architecture, which is modern in very many senses, but it does not look it. German Reform architecture was early 20th century, and it looks like a continuation of the tradition that was there before then. They were dealing, however, with social issues. That tradition is something that we are trying to connect to, and I think that is a debate that we could probably talk about a lot longer, but something that is also very important to think about. Yeah.
To answer your question, if you're building a building, unless you're building it in the middle of the forest where no one can see it, it's your building and it's the other people's view and part of other people's town. So I think the key word is respect, and that's one of the reasons why I like Castelvecchio, because it's made with respect, and that's why I don't like the Hamarloven with Fenn, because he has no respect for what's there before. And then the question is, of course, what does the word respect mean? And I think that's, to some ways, that's up to the community. And you have to that's a democratic question, so to say. And everything cannot be decided by a rule book. We don't want to live there. That's a bad place to be. But I think also we need to be everyone in a place where respect is important, and respect for the common town, the common place, and stuff like that. So it's and that's a democratic question. So everything cannot be allowed, but the rule book, it must be quite loose in the edges, I think.
Is that your closing remarks?
I wasn't ready for that one yet, but yes.
Just give me a few closing remarks.
No, it's good. I'm good there. Thanks.
Robert.
I'll just pick up on my closing remarks. One of my favorite subjects is actually what is a tradition, and it's a complex issue to do with identity. But I want to use that as a means of saying something where it's going to make me very unpopular. I have to run for the exit after this. Is that modernists are also have their own traditions. Traditions are something that take place after 3 generations, and they've had 3 generations of modernism. And most modernists admit it, that it is. But that leads me to another point, which actually somewhat goes to respect as well. I know we are all slamming modernists and saying terrible things about them. Some of these are friends of mine. And they're not bad people. They're misguided people. And there is a difference. And I've made it my business, actually, and that's what's got me onto various government committees, is to actually work with other architects, regardless of whether I disagree with them or not, on the basis that that's the best way for them to actually understand what I'm trying to do, and give me that aspect of my profession more space. I mean, genuinely. I mean, Will Alsop, who I think I showed in my lecture, who was you know, a sort of second-tier star architect, was a good friend of mine, and as a result of that, he was much more tolerant of what I would do, because it's much more difficult to insult a person than it is an idea. And I worry sometimes that we just attack just a touch too much. We need to succeed, and the way we succeed is by making friends, not enemies. I wasn't expecting that.
Very hard for all.
I also think it's not a matter of rules. The only reason we have to have rules today is we don't have respect for traditions. The whole point of having a tradition is that you then don't need the rules, because that's what the tradition is. Yeah. And each place has its own tradition, so you can't end up with buildings all looking exactly the same. That was only something specific that the international style wanted to do. And that's why that's happened. You go back in history, and classical buildings are different in different parts of the world. And that's what it's about. It's a matter of, you've got classicism, but you also have the local traditions, and you do things and respect those traditions. And that's how you get diversity in places that people like, and places which are cohesive and have the diversity too.
And Eric, closing remarks.
This is now closing remarks.
No, it's the closing remarks. Now we are on overtime.
Yeah, no?
Now it's ready for the drinks afterwards. But the closing remarks.
I just want to say thank you to everybody who organized this event. It's been incredibly edifying for me. We basically sprinted from the airport yesterday morning to see your lecture, Mr. Adam, and I will never unsee Fibonacci Trump. It was I've never seen that image before. It was fantastic. I think any amount of technical difficulty would not have taken away from your lecture today. It was very inspirational. It didn't matter. If there were no slides, it would have been amazing, honestly. And I'm happy to see this, as soon as you brought up Castelvecchio, and there was a very audible response from the audience, I'm glad to see that that was also discussed today. That was something that had, up to that point, been mentioned, but I think you nailed it on the head. So, and to everyone else, the educators, the practitioners, craftsmen, this format has really impressed me. And I know many people have said it, but I think that the flat hierarchy that's represented here, the fact that I'm on stage with these illustrious gentlemen and get to take part in this debate, that is something that should be kept as it moves forward. So thanks again.
Thank you.
So thank you. Thank you for the conversation, and to the panel. I hope to see any of you, some of you, everyone with drinks afterwards. I'm not sure if it is for everyone, or at least I'm going there. And I also think that I think it's these kind of conversations are really important when it comes to establishing a culture of traditional contemporary architecture. I think it's of course like the fantastic summer school that it was arranged last year. I think it was Interbouw here in Fredrikstad area. There's all these kind of things, and I also think for me it's important that the National Trust and other who also advocates for traditional building, new building materials, new ways of using that, because for me, like, we're not working with solar panels. We are working with vernacular, or like traditional architecture, techniques that can be changed, modified over time. And after a while, I hope we will arrive to that place where I used to go, I go in the summer to an island called Kea, outside of Athens, and sometimes to Sifnos. And in the Cyclades, I think a neighbor pretty much knows what kind of house they're going to build next to their own neighbors. And they know that the small bench in the steep terrain, they need to build a small bench outside of their door. Often the door is the only thing that sort of signals what kind of tastes the owner has, because the rest of the architecture is a part of the community. And I think we lack that kind of knowledge in Norway. And I think to build that kind of knowledge and to build that kind of culture is the most important way to create a sort of a contemporary traditional architecture. And I think these kind of conversations sort of makes that possible. So thanks to the audience and to the panel. It's nice.
Thank you. Thank you. IKEA has a famous lion, doesn't it?